Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. There is no happiness like mine. I have been eating poetry. The librarian does not believe what she sees. Her eyes are sad, and she walks with her hands in her dress. The poems are gone. The light is dim. The dogs are on the basement stairs and coming up. Their eyeballs roll, their blonde legs burn like brush. The poor librarian begins to stamp her feet and weep. She does not understand when I get on my knees and I lick her hand. She screams. I am a new man. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. I'm doing the poem Eating Poetry by Mark Strand. And it is a 6-stanza poem, which consists of 3 lines in each stanza. I found the speaker in stanza 6 and stanza 1. It basically explains that he's the person who's eating the poetry. It says that he's a new man in stanza 6, and that the ink was running from the corners of his mouth, and that he had been eating the poetry. The occasion is in the library, and one interesting thing about the occasion in this piece is that in stanza 3, it says the light is dim, and it kind of adds an eeriness to the poem, and it adds just like this mystery to what is happening in the library exactly. The audience, I don't really think there is a clear audience for this poem. However, I do think it is to entertain, but it's also to speak about the selfishness of the speaker in his decision to eat the poetry, because it does bring him happiness. However, it brings him happiness at the expense of the librarian, who truly just does not understand what is happening and why he's eating the poem and poetry. For this poem, I had a hard time finding a clear purpose in the poem, but as I read more detail and as I read closer, I realized that one of the purposes is to educate the more of the repercussions that your actions have on other people. So basically, the speaker's actions of eating the poetry very much upset the librarian, and that speaks to the repercussions that anyone's actions have on other people, and that the fact that his happiness came at the expense of the librarian's happiness. It says in stanza 3 that the poems are gone, and that really harps on the fact that the poetry being gone upsets the librarian, and it doesn't just affect her, it affects the other people who come into that library, and if they came to read poetry, they're going to be let down and they're going to be upset because he was selfish enough to eat the poems just because it brought him happiness. The subject of eating poetry is just that. It's him eating the poetry. It's the action of him eating the poetry and how it affects the other people around him, and how eating the poetry affects him in general. It basically turns him into a selfish animal. And in the 6th stanza, it says, I am a new man, I snarl at her and bark, I romp with joy in the bookish dark. That really just says he is basically a new person because he ate the poetry, and I feel like that is definitely the subject, is just him eating the poetry. The tone of this poem is very much so that of joy, and it says in stanza 6, I romp with joy in the bookish dark, and in stanza 1, there is no happiness like mine. And I think that his tone is very happy in regards to his emotion, but when you see him describing the librarian's emotion, the tone sort of flips and it becomes more somber and sad because that's what she's feeling. And I think that the tone of the poem really does emulate the emotion of the characters in the poem, because each one of them, the tone flips when they speak about each other.